Hello, friends. We have made it to Chapter 3 in Unit 1. This is going to be Business and the Constitution. The good news is that some of these things you're going to be hearing for the second, third, fourth, maybe fifth time, and hopefully they're starting to solidify for you now. It is broken down into four different sections. The way I have it broken down is federal powers, state powers, and the supremacy clause will all be together. Sounds familiar, right? Checks of government power, and then we're going to talk about the Commerce Clause and the Takings Clause because those are two important uh, powers that the governments are given in the Constitution. So, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that the Constitution, what? It empowers government, it limits government, and anything that's unconstitutional is void, ain't never happen, right? So, the question is, what can the federal government do? Let's start there because the Constitution originally was, hey, let's sit down and let's make a federal constitution, okay? This is what you need to know. It's very important. The federal government has enumerated powers. So somewhere they have a list on article, and I'll show you a list of powers and whether the government can actually make any laws or any regulations, it has to have some power that it can draw from the Constitution. Okay, that's the first thing. The law has to, they have to have the power to make the law. And the second thing is that it cannot violate of the independent checks, right? The Bill of Rights. It cannot go against our rights. And we talked about that when we talked about the Constitution. So what are these enumerated powers? Well, they're the powers of the federal government that are listed in the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, I don't expect you to know all of these, but just be familiar that what the Constitution does is it tells the federal government, this is what you can do, okay? The state government, how do we know what they can do? Well, Article 1 limits the powers of the state because it's then says the 10th Amendment gives power to the state. So we got Article 1 that limits the powers of the state basically by saying, hey, these are the things the federal government are exclusively in charge of. But the 10th Amendment then says, hey, we're going to give you some power if the federal government does not have it or we haven't denied that power to you in the Constitution through Article 1, we're going to give it to you. Basically, the 10th Amendment empowers the states by saying the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by the states, and we're going to see in a second how they're limited, are reserved to the states. So the states then have the power to enact their own legislation. So Article 1, Section 10 is what limits the powers. And it's saying, hey, these things you cannot do, states. You can't enter into treaties, alliances, or confederation. You can't, without the consent of Congress, have imposts or duties on imports or exports. And you can't, without the power of Congress, do all these other things, okay? You don't need to know the exact powers they don't have. What you need to know is they are limited by Article 1, Section 18, or Section 10, and the 14th Amendment. Remember, we talked about the 14th Amendment being passed, the Due Process Clause, because of this after the Civil War, and this limits them. They now, after the 14th Amendment was passed, have the same restrictions that the federal government have, and they cannot deprive any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person with its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So what it's saying is, guess what, state governments? You can't discriminate. You can't take away someone's right to speech. All of those things in the 14th Amendment. So what do state governments do? Well, in a nutshell, they do a lot. They handle ownership of property, they handle education for the state, welfare and other benefit programs, distribution of aid, protect people from local threats. They have their own justice system, right? We have the state and the federal courts. They maintain their state highways and setting up the means of transportation, regulate industry. They set up local governments. We're going to talk about that in a second. And they raise funds to support activities. These are the main kind of things they do, but they are very responsible for the day-to-day things that happen in a state. Each state has its own structure, and so usually we'll have these counties and municipalities. Municipalities are like your cities and your towns. This is what you call your local government, and the state will set that up. Now, all states' governments are divided into the legislative, judicial, and executive branch, but actually the federal constitution just says they have to have a Republican form. They don't necessarily have to have the three branches, but all of our governments do. Concurrent powers. These are powers that are going to be shared both by the state and federal government. They are going to let our state tax us. They are going to let have a police force, and they're going to have a spending power, just like the government has those same powers. So we call them concurrent powers. And as long as the legislation that the federal government passes, right, does not conflict or impede, is not conflicted or impeded by state government, then they can legislate and regulate as they want. But remember, we have the supremacy clause, and that is where it says that the Constitution and federal law is the supreme law of the land. So what does that mean? Federal preemption, right? If federal and state both regulate commerce, but they conflict, for example, then the federal law is going to trump. This is nothing new. We've discussed it several times already, so hopefully this is a little bit of review for you. So that really breaks down the difference between the federal and the state government. And if you see, it goes all back to our theme of the Constitution, which gives empowerment to the government, it restricts the government, and anything that is not in the Constitution then is void. So what's next? The next thing we're going to talk about is our checks on government power. How do we make sure that they do not encroach on our liberties? And we will talk about that in the next lecture.